I'm going to hand over now to Julia Scott-Stevenson, who's going to host the first panel of the morning and discuss some of the issues that I've just introduced and unpack them with some case study conversations with some of our fellows. So, Julia, over to you. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Julia Scott-Stevenson. I'm one of the Immersion Fellows. I'm also a research fellow in interactive factual media at UWE Bristol, based here in Watershed, working with the Digital Cultures Research Centre. And shortly I'm also going to introduce the rest of the panel this morning, made up of Duncan Speakman, Vincent Baidoo-Lowe and Aste Amundsen. Last Friday morning I was sitting on a bench by the harbour side with two other fellows, Duncan and Harry Wilmot, as Harry interviewed us both for a podcast that he's been making. We had a really wide-ranging discussion about immersion, and I'm glad that Joe talked about questions because a lot of questions emerged, and that's something I'm going to touch on a bit now. Not least, why do large trucks and commercial mowers always appear when you're trying to record audio? But also one particular question that came up more than once from both of us at different points in our chat, which was essentially why immersion? Why use immersive media experiences? Why are we trying to create these things? And this question has probably underlain everything that we as fellows have been doing throughout this process, this why question, as well as many others. The process started with a question. We were all asked to formulate a question that we brought to this actual fellowship process, something that we wanted to ask of each other, of the relevant industries, of what is or what might be possible. Then there were the requests or the prompts given. Joe asked us to be present. Nicole asked us to map our networks and resources. Tanya asked us to consider the layered states of immersion and how we can inhabit more than one simultaneously. Teresa asked us to keep the Sustainable Development Goals at the forefront of our minds. Seth asked us to close our eyes and to breathe and to reflect. Katie asked us to remember that prototyping isn't the only gig in town. And John reminded us that forgetting the body is an old patriarchal trick and implored us to resist the idea that the world is something that we want to remove ourselves from. So through that process and then following from that, what all of us were doing really was either crafting or guiding or unearthing a view on the world of immersion, just at differing scales. So some of us were looking at the micro scale, imagining how to maybe technologically mediate or augment the relationship between an audience member and perhaps a very particular part of a story or experience. Some of us zoomed out to think about how this mediation might change experience delivery across a sector. And some of us have been thinking at another scale again. What are the external forces outside immersion that bend and twist what we can do and what we should do? So on this panel and across the cohort, there's a vast diversity of skills and approaches, but one common element that I've seen emerge is this rejection of the notion of the viewer as a conscious dot, this single set of eyes and ears that are viewing a virtual world. We as fellows want to speak and to question and to touch things and to move our bodies and to be with others while we do it. We're both collecting and creating rich sensory information and examining how we can augment and adapt someone's existing reality, change its pace, enrich it, heighten it, dampen it, relocate it somewhere or somewhere entirely different. We're also exploring how we can lead people into and out of those immersive states through the threshold spaces in a careful and caring way. And we're asking why, always why, we would want to do any of these things in the first place. Now, I come from a background of traditional screen and interactive documentary. And one of the things that documentary does really well is it connects the micro with the macro. So it takes a small story, maybe a personal story, which turns out to actually mean something much bigger. And this has informed my own approach to my research on the fellowship. So looking across a range of immersive experiences and works, I started to identify a number of small independent elements that seemed common to work that I thought was perhaps stronger. Stepping back to look at what I'd found, I realised that these elements had formed themselves into a manifesto. My other starting point for the research was an interest in looking at ways forward to a preferred future. I understood the imperative to make work that took us somewhere else, but I was curious as to why a lot of these somewhere elses were dystopian futures or internal narratives of loss and of less. I thought the time was right for a hopeful glance forwards. So I'm going to very just briefly outline my manifesto points here, which were initially for the making of work that aims for a preferred future, but ideally it's useful for many other kinds of work too. So point one, to stage an encounter. This was sparked by a chat with Professor Mandy Rose about talking through how we might sidestep this tricky question of empathy, and rather than trying to walk in another person's shoes, maybe craft an encounter where you go to meet someone for a while, have a connection or a conversation. Point two, be wild. Bewilderment is powerful. This is getting at the idea of bewilderment as partaking in a state of being wild, a reminder of our animal state and our existence within a vast and complex system. And I'm interested in work that elicits joy and awe and catharsis in that natural system. Also, I'll be talking more about bewilderment and digging into that at 4 o'clock today on a session with Duncan and David as well, if you're interested. Point 3, move from being to doing. So how does a participant or an audience member take some control over what's happening or have some agency in the process? Embody the future. So using that unique sense of presence available as a conduit to a different kind of engagement. Perhaps it's providing the opportunity to move or to speak might allow users to realise that they can move and speak in other ways in their lives too. And finally, care. The participants matter. And I mean this in 2 ways. One, in care for them before, during and after the experience, and also care for their data and their privacy and in what we collect about them and how we use that and how we protect that. So I hope that this is useful to some of you, not just for thinking through how to make immersive media, but also how to commission it, how to exhibit it, how to curate it. And so thank you now, and I'll hand over to Duncan.
Oh, sorry. Nice. Hi, I'm Duncan Speakman. I'm an artist, and because being an artist is my job rather than my calling, I've always been quite rather kind of grumpy, opinionated, and frustrated with things, as people who know me will have probably heard me rant before. About 10 years ago in 2009, I was making mass participation headphone experiences in cities. And this was at the period when immersive theatre was the current buzzword at the time. Punch Drunk were kind of on the rise. And people were talking about my work as immersive theatre, which, of course, annoyed me and frustrated me, because what I didn't want people to think was that they're immersed in the work I'm making. I was sending people out into the world, listening to things, but trying to get them to engage with the cities they inhabit. I was thinking about them more as being present rather than immersed. So 10 years later, I come to this period where immersion suddenly seems to be now a shorthand for kind of mediated content, for VR, for things that wrap around us and cocoon us. And I'm frustrated again, but this network appears and it seems to ask more interesting questions and brings together a wider range of people who are coming from immersion from lots and lots of different directions. So I came to this through 2 strands, really. One was a kind of craft-based strand. It was thinking about how we make things with this sense of immersion. And that was really looking at ideas like, how do filmmakers who are working in VR understand the audience being present within the work, not just a viewer and not just a conscious dot, and not being able to control the frame. Maybe they learn that from theatre makers who do understand what it's like to be present, but don't understand what it's like for a performer or an actor to look you in the eyes, but not really actually know you're there. So pulling together these kind of different crafts and approaches and histories, I made a book, because that's the way to do things. So I made a book called No Vantage Point, which I'll come to in a moment. And it's a set of exercises, experiments, provocations, things to try out when you're making things drawn from different fields I've kind of worked in. And it's not full in here, so I didn't think I was going to be able to do the you get a book and you get a book, but there will be all of them outside on the desk, so you can pick them up on your way out. It's called No Vantage Point for a reason, because there was another strand that came to me while I was working on this. I said that this shorthand for immersion is about cocooning, is about something wrapping around us. That seems to be the way we keep talking about it, content which somehow puts us inside it. And what I've been thinking about, I guess all the time, but it's sort of become a real focus for me now, is that we're actually always immersed in lots and lots of different things. We're immersed in ecologies, we're immersed in networks of people, we're immersed in phone networks, we're immersed in communication networks, we're immersed in electromagnetic fields around us, we're immersed in social networks. And I think one way we can think about immersive media is not media that's cocooning us, but instead it's media that's revealing those networks and those things we're already immersed in, the different layers of immersion and where those edges are. And by doing that, it might make us feel maybe not as important, and make sure we understand that we're always entangled within things. And when you're right inside something, there might not be a vantage point. And that's me.
Hi, I'm Aste and I make interactive immersive theatre. So my fellowship research has focused on profiling to personalize live immersive audience experiences. So currently the most, I noticed actually one of my questions was on your little card, so you might have seen it. So basically, a lot of the systems for profiling that we all interact with in our everyday lives are shaped to attain sales. So my question, and as my primary motivation coming into this, is how to create mobilizing transformative audience experiences. What would a profiling system for transformational audience experiences look like? So for a bit of background, I arrived at both immersive theatre and personalised interaction from the direction of art for activism. And my first use of tech to manage and scale personalised interaction was within a show called the Apocalypse Game Show, which these cards are from. The idea there was that allowing someone to play act a sort of a dark comedy doomsday scenario based on their particular fear of the future might ease them into engagement with difficult subject matter that they might otherwise dissociate from. The hope was to sort of achieve a type of dark comedy catharsis, perhaps. But the technical means to employ individual audience data in live interaction turned out as sort of a game changer in itself and led me to forming computer-aided theatre in 2016 to develop a set of audience interaction tools for live performance producers. As I understand it, the promise within Immersion is that you as an audience member will be transported into the center of an unfolding story. To deliver that, we need the means to locate audience members in that story world. So obviously digital and physical spaces solve that quite differently. I believe that personalized interaction moves us closer to really delivering on that promise by offering individual audience members recognizable and persistent narrative presence and in-world identity. So currently in theatre and live event settings, data used for personalization can be very simple and still represent a step change from the normally fragmented experiences that are on offer. So, but however, in our day-to-day life, as I mentioned earlier, we're obviously now on the receiving end of much more complex and sophisticated data gathering and profiling project. So the Immersion Fellowship allowed me to spend some time researching and comparing existing profiling systems and considering what might be useful to know about somebody to better transport them into a story. And how might different types of personal audience data change the kind of stories that we can tell. What I've arrived at looks to me like the beginnings of a dramaturgy of personalization, which I now want to move into the realm of prototyping and playtesting. My research threw up a number of parallels to taxonomies of player agency in playable stories. And much has been said about within that context about the difference between choice reflected in branching or responsive story forms versus audience experience of choice that is transmitted without those kind of mechanisms. And I believe that hang on. Oh, I seem to be one slide behind myself. Sorry. So I believe that the analogy in personalization might turn out to be the Barnum effect, hence this slide. So a certain type of open statement is quite likely to convey equal or greater experience of personal acknowledgement or of being seen or responded to than a narrative employing branching responsive story forms in response to profiling, depending on whether you choose your parameters for profiling well and stage that well. So with that caveat, at the moment I'm seeing this in terms of layers of audience data, with a base layer adapted from player profiling systems for computer games. So gauging whether an audience member is approaching a particular experience I'm making as a socializer or killer would definitely be useful for me in approaching them, whether I'm aiming to challenge or cater to their particular approach. Another sort of middle layer might comprise of psychological, cognitive, or perceptual data. So, and within this layer, looking at the sorts of frameworks that exist, this is where I see most potential for completely new formats of storytelling. Coming back to my original motivations, perceptual testing of all the different things that I came across seems to be the most promising to me. So identifying and challenging cognitive bias in individual audience members seems like quite a promising basis for writing and delivering personal transformations within an audience experience. At the top level, there's obviously story or theme theme-specific info. So for the Apocalypse Game Show, which I mentioned earlier, it was useful for me to know how you feel about climate change or how you deal with your particular future fear and so on. But for any story, there's going to be information like that tells you how a particular audience member is likely to locate themselves in a story that you're telling. So all of this is ultimately about developing better means of more fully transporting audience members into the center of a story. To what end? So at the moment, what I'm seeing is that most instances of data and profiling is applied to or extending the time we spend in already familiar or known story worlds. So the classics like theme parks follow this kind of pattern. Most of the large commercial immersive theater experiences follow this pattern as well. But Secret Cinema is a perfect example. These kind of experiences rely on our familiarity with and excitement at being in these kind of worlds we already know and being able to step into a sort of a movie frame. For me, I hope that as our ability to insert audiences into story worlds get better, that personalized interaction and complex immersive storytelling starts to play a role in articulating new worlds and in scenario testing and mobilizing for preferred futures.
So my name is Vincent Baidoo-Lowe, and historically I've done community-based transmedia, so that's using music, films, animations, and games as personal expression in terms of mentorship, engaging hard-to-reach people, and forms of community cohesion, community activism, that kind of stuff. So I was looking into virtual marginalization, and so what I mean by virtual marginalization isn't necessarily what the picture depicts in terms of people isolating themselves from the world by over excessive use of virtual technologies. It's actually about the historic marginalization which has happened within media, people within power using fictional and non-fictional narratives as a way to marginalize certain communities. And for me, it was specifically about addressing the Black community. So because of what had happened previously within media, and then how the agenda had stayed the same within social media, but then the forms kind of take a different route. So within social media, things like bots that are used to kind of alter the sway of conversation under particular parts of mediums, that's very specific to social media and doesn't quite exist within old media. So what I wanted to look at is how these things may form within a virtual landscape, what the differences might be, and obviously ways that we can prepare and possibly kind of stop this thing happening. So what I ended up, my question that I looked into was what tools, or the tools that use, that that allow people to create virtual, immersive digital experiences that don't necessarily need people to know how to code, how can that possibly affect marginalization of particular communities? So this is just like a very unclear graph, but what it shows is down the left side was all the different tools I found that have these kind of capabilities, and across the top were the different features that they had. So it goes from actually being able to export different kind of experiences, so whether they're AR, whether they're VR, all the way down to can you use your own custom graphics, can you use your own custom sound, these kind of things. So this is what I found, and as you can see, there wasn't any one that really kind of had everything, and the angle that I was coming from at this is there's a type of software which I call like makers, so these are the kind of softwares where you have game makers, you have sound makers, and so it was possibly looking at, okay, is there a virtual reality maker out there, and if this goes into hands of marginalized communities, can they kind of insert themselves within this genre? So the way that the fellowship worked is we were always aware that there's going to be this opportunity to create a prototype. And so for me, like very consciously, it was, okay, I'm looking at this thing, and in my head, I'm going to try and devise a prototype that will hopefully deal with the problem that I'm looking at. But it led me to a very interesting position, because as I went, did my pitches, had this opportunity to do the prototype, I kind of had to confront the idea that, okay, so I'm going to be putting forward this piece of software, and I'm going to be saying, hey, this is going to help with virtual marginalization. But if that same exact piece of software that I was about to present was being presented by somebody else who wasn't black, then would I say that this thing's going to help? And the answer at that point was no. So then it was like, what was I actually talking about? What was I getting at? Like, what was this whole thing for? So in the end, really, this is what it actually came down to. That, you know, there's specific bits of software that people can use, and there are routes to kind of get people engaged in not only virtual technologies, just digital technologies in general, but actually the only way of really dealing with virtual marginalization is by addressing these particular issues within a technological context overall, with the main one for me being ownership. And so that was the kind of conclusion that I came to, that actually one of the big benefits within this fellowship was that the whole way through, we made very aware that we own everything that we do, that we have all of these opportunities, and that we actually get to create something with the aim of it being, you know, having like a financial route to market. So yeah, these are the 4 points that I ended up coming to, and if you go onto the Southwest Creative Technology Network website and you click on my super close-up, then I've got the whole talk. It's like an hour-long talk where I go through all of this stuff. Thank you.
So I've got 3 questions that I'm going to direct at each of you guys that they've had a bit of a heads up on as well. And I guess the first one, at a number of points throughout the fellowship workshops, I'd be having a conversation with a different fellow, and we'd be sort of talking about approaches and ideas that we had for making something. And on more than one occasion, we kind of came to the conclusion at the end, are we maybe just talking about making 2 people sit down and have a cup of tea together? And so this is kind of back to my original why question. Why use these immersive media approaches? And you've probably already talked about this in each of your presentations, but maybe just kind of a brief overview on why.
Me first? Yeah. Okay. So for me, it's a really specific agenda at the moment, which is using augmented reality. I mean, specifically, I'm using augmented audio, so just being able to mix and layer together the sound that you hear through your ears in an environment and combining that with specialized headphones with microphones that bring in the sound and combine them. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm trying to deal with climate collapse in a way that makes it horrific and present where you are right now. And so the issue for me is if you show a film or a photograph of it, it risks leading to that separation and that distance. Mm-hmm. I think a VR experience for me does something very similar. It creates a sort of distance or a sort of fictional beauty about these kind of things. What I really want audiences to kind of experience, maybe understand, is the entanglement, is that sort of complex network between what I'm doing right now in the environment I live in, and these other things happening around in the world, and yeah, sort of, it's a really good tool for doing that. And what's interesting is I've that technology's been around. I've been doing versions of that for about 10 years. And actually, it's only been in the last year that it's suddenly made sense content-wise to me. It took me that long to find out the why, actually. So it's not like, oh yeah, this is the why. It's taken a long time to realise why it's useful.
To figure out, and now it's clear. Cool.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels in that. I've arrived at making immersive theatre specifically because I feel there's something mobilizing, and it's something very sort of there's a primacy to human interaction. So I want to bring somebody, make them present in a moment, but sort of to do that. As a theatre maker or as a theatre audience, I always feel that there's a boundary there in terms of if I'm not fully seen, then I'm not, there's still a distance there. So a lot of immersive theatre for me feels like ultimately, to use a theatre term, the fourth wall is just being stuck on your face. It's like if you're not being offered an actual presence yourself in the story, that's kind of what you're up against. And again. I also, my motivation in bringing people, making people present in these kind of environments is also to, I ultimately I'm interested in social change. There's so many things that we as a society need to change, and we need a bunch of tools that we clearly don't have yet. So, and I guess I've sort of felt all along that maybe there's possibilities and potentials in this area. We're not great as a whole at imagining something that we haven't seen yet. We tend to default to the familiar, and so these kind of experiences, immersive theatre experiences, for me are always a kind of an attempt to transport people into something they don't know yet, giving them a sort of a playable, safe, well, not safe necessarily as in comfortable, but safe as in safe to fail, safe to try something. Yeah, these kind of scenario testing of something that we don't know yet.
Okay, great. Thanks. And Vince?
In terms of a why, I think for me a big part of it is just about curiosity. Like there's something where you go into an immersive experience, and though a lot of people can say that they're gimmicky, there's a lot of novelties involved, but the actual initial excitement and awe that comes from it is there for a reason, and it's a signifier of something, I think. So there's just like a curiosity in exploring that space and the possible expressions, and then within that, the playing field that is this kind of digital immersion landscape as compared to other more established medias like film and music and those kind of things. In terms of marginalized communities, the entry level, like getting in now and really being able to shape something, that possibility really exists here. You kind of the difference between going to something where there's loads of immersive things being shown, quite a lot of the time they're prototype-y type kind of showcases of possibilities. And so within those possibilities is every possibility. So being able to get people who kind of to bring down those barriers, because I feel like kind of doing the research that I've seen, a lot of these barriers seem slightly artificial and created from an enterprising aspect that obviously if you've decided to invest in creating digital immersion, then you have a fair agenda to kind of keep a boundary around the magic and how it is that you create that. But in reality, it's only as difficult as every other thing that it needs to take time to master. So being able to go in there with that aspect of genuinely anything can happen, and this is something that I can get my head around, I think opens up the opportunities, because it may not be virtual reality, it may not be AR, but like I'm saying, that initial awe that people have is for a reason. So I genuinely feel like it's going to be something, like it's going to be something within this direction, and now would be the time to really have a shape in what this final kind of digital immersive mass adopted thing would look like in the end.
Okay, so we're talking about creative exploration that allows people to connect with either environmental issues, social change, social impact, smashing down some barriers to access, and creating that sense of awe, which might lead to all of those things, perhaps. So my second question, and maybe I'll start with Aste for this one. Who is it for, what you do? Or maybe who would you like to see it in front of that it's not already in front of?
I think, well, traditionally I have worked a lot in a festival setting. I'm kind of fairly squarely from a countercultural kind of background. And I've spent a lot of time making experiences for audiences who I could refer to as having sort of voluntarily reduced cognition. So, or altered cognition. So there's, so that's an interesting parameter of what I do. I like performing to or making experiences for audiences that aren't well behaved. So audiences that aren't necessarily very sort of heavily sworn to a certain set of social rules of how they should behave, because I find those kind of audiences...
We're not talking opera.
Yeah. I find those kind of audiences more conducive to really creating very live experiences, which is central to what I'm interested in. So I'm, as to what I'm doing now and talked about in the intro, I'm keen to keep it in that way of being, I'm hoping that these kind of tools make it easier to address and include people that aren't specifically coming to have a sort of a sit-down or well-behaved cultural experience. So, and I'm also hoping, in a way, so one of my starting points for getting into interactive theatre way back in the mid-90s was forum theatre. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Auguste Boal's work. So he was specifically using theatre as a forum for debate and sort of social change. So in a way, I'm also hoping that these kind of tools for data augmenting human-to-human live interaction could have a sort of an extended use, not just in terms of entertainment, but also in terms of facilitating cooperative, co-creative kind of creative scenarios.
Great, thank you. Vince, how about you?
So who's it for?
Who's it for, or who would you like it to be for that it might not currently be for?
Well, I mean, so obviously with the nature of the work that I'm doing, like I definitely want to get black people involved in terms of the production of things, and not just being the front and the faces of a lot of stuff. But just like many other things that have happened historically, like that would also be so that everybody then ends up. And what I mean by that is, for me, what I would like to see within like this space is to skip the stage where everyone's a passive consumer and there's like a heavy reliance on kind of AAA massively produced huge budget experiences, and kind of skip straight to that kind of YouTube vlogger, I create something, somebody responds back to it, and having those kind of mediums there. So that's really kind of what I would like to see and who I would like it to be for, that it's like it's for everybody, but in that sense it's more about the kind of the magic being shown and everybody feeling like it's accessible. So therefore the passionate ones will then get involved, and that the creative landscape, like I'm saying, will kind of skip that Hollywood stage where everything's very easy to manipulate, and kind of go straight to that peer-to-peer call and response kind of interaction with however the actual end hardware or thing that people end up using.
Oh, thank you. Duncan?
I'm terrible at answering this question. Anyone who's done a sort of business mentorship with me, taking me through one, will know I just really struggle to think about audiences for the work I make, because I just think, well, I'm making it for anyone who, maybe not people who are that young, because it's quite loud at the moment and I wouldn't want to damage people's hearing too soon. But
Too soon.
yeah, so in terms of audiences for the kind of the works I'm making, the desire, like who I want to do it, is anyone who has sort of become disconnected from, that's wrong, has become unaware of their connections to everything around them. They're not actually, we're never actually disconnected from everything, we just choose to kind of ignore it in a way.
Recognition.
So I guess audio, like it's easier for me, I guess, in terms of talking about making the book for this project, the audience was quite clear. It's kind of for makers, you know, that was easier because this is for people who are already exploring this area, who might come from one field, and it's offering a bunch of things from other fields into that. But yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Next question.
Well, maybe I'll throw the next question at you, which is what's changed for you throughout this fellowship process, maybe in your thinking or approach, or has anything changed for you?
Like a sort of simplicity about what it sounds strange actually, but becoming to a more simple sort of understanding of what immersion means, and for me just it meaning you're in something, like on a really simple level, and then everything else is about deciding what the thing is that we want to show you you're in. Maybe we're creating something you're in, you know, virtually or augmenting. Maybe we're just revealing something you're already in. So just going, okay, let's just stop thinking about immersion itself as a really complex thing, and let's think about all these ways we're sort of addressing it as being the complex thing. And I think the other thing that changed was it was just really refreshing to see that there's a wide range of people who don't go, immersive, you mean VR? You know, like that there's a whole bunch of different thinking around what that can mean, and the kind of works, you know, just across the three of us on the panel. That was exciting, I think.
Yeah, sure. Vince, how about you? What's changed for you?
Well, the major change for me is just getting more hands-on with the technical side of stuff. So I kind of, clearly somewhere in my subconscious, I kind of knew kind of where I wanted to go. So within the first 3-month deep thinking period that we had, I also used that just to kind of start doing some coding, making some bots and those kind of things. So I did kind of wanted to be able to get to the end of the research and be like, hey, I can kind of make some stuff. But that really just kind of turned into a rabbit hole that hasn't stopped. So been game making, Nintendo sent me hardware and software so I can start making stuff with them. Silas has let me play around and be programming with his robots. By the end of the year, hopefully I'll be like qualified in cybersecurity, that kind of stuff. So, so yeah, just for me, it was just like that road of really like engaging like my creative side with the coding thing, and like finding a really nice kind of unpressurized fit and the same kind of passion that I have when I'm making my comics and my animations. Now the kind of the coding aspect of it, so like the idea that I could create a game and that I would actually understand how the security aspects of it is working, it's really exciting for me, both on the practical world building sense, because the more things I can do, the more financially practically like these things are, but then also I really like it from a fictional level. I'm into sci-fi and stuff, so when I'm thinking about fantastical and magical ways for things to happen, all of these technical elements that used to just feel like magic to me now, that understanding. So yeah, that's really been the hole that I fell down, pretty much.
Fantastic, thanks. Aste?
On a personal level, I think up until this point, being a kind of freelance creative and running a small company as well, I haven't really had very much time to research. So there's been a lot of questions that have come directly out of the kind of creative process that I've had and the kind of productions that I've made, but I haven't really had time to look fully into all the sort of larger context of those possibilities that were emerging from my work. So it's been amazing to actually have some time to look into these questions, and in doing so, I realized obviously pretty quickly that the scale of my questions were vastly outstripping kind of the time that I had to do that, but which was a wonderful thing to find out, and I'm now sort of expanding that out as a process, and that's going to be an ongoing thing for me now. So that's one thing. It's been hugely valuable to be within a peer group. So a bit like what Duncan was saying, it's very valuable to see a great breadth of different sorts of practices and thinking. And for me, a lot of my creative process has been either quite isolated or very specifically within immersive theatre or festivals. So coming up against very different practices that are equally about immersion but have very different assumptions, different vocabulary, all that kind of stuff has been brilliant, both in clarifying what my particular assumptions are and in kind of examining our predicament as independent creatives trying to make this kind of work. Because I think it's very easy when you're siloed or sort of on your own over here creating something to think that the conditions you're working under are specific to you. And so seeing how, where we were all sitting within this sort of larger field and economic developments and streams of funding and streams of thought at the moment, and what it's like to be, which I think on the whole we are independent makers or academics, that's been very illuminating and sort of given a much better overview over really what are the possibilities within the immersive sector at the moment, and what do we need to be able to really to thrive and scale up as well.
Okay, cool. So, in fact, basically sometimes it really is just about having a cup of tea with someone, but within that network. And what we did was highlight the phenomenal kind of networks and connections and the bigger picture that was out there beyond our own individual sectors and worlds, perhaps. All right, well, thank you, Duncan and Aste and Vince, and back to Jo.
Yeah.
We've got about 10 minutes for some questions from the audience, if that's okay. We've got a roving mic that Hannah's got. Is there anything that anybody wants to ask? Anybody? Over here.
Hi there. Immersive isn't a single medium, we talked about, and we talked about the fact that there's novelty the first time you put on a headset or the first time you go to an immersive theatre experience. And then you talked about the actually trying to create moments of awe. And then you think about traditional mediums like theatre and cinema, and there's lots of devices and conventions that you use to guide the audience through a story. So I wonder how those two worlds meet, because if everything's just awe and novelty, I'm just wide-eyed and just stunned. How do you guide me into an experience so that I can have something meaningful, fulfilling, or is that an irrelevant question?
No, it's not an irrelevant question at all. It's a really important question for me. And I think, like when I was saying that, what I was making 10 years ago was described as immersive at the time, that form of work, those kind of audio walk experiences, I'm still making them. And because I'm still learning the tricks, building the tricks in and developing that same kind of, the sort of techniques that you're talking about in film and theatre, but just in this field. I think one of the things with novelty is that it's the first time you experience something that's novel and you have that awe, and as you see more of them, you lose the awe and you start actually paying attention to the content. So in a way, I'm more excited. Like, if someone does a piece I've made and they've never experienced that form before, they'll be, ooh, and that's great. I love the awe, that's brilliant. But actually, that's not what the piece is about. The piece isn't about the type of experience. There's a subject matter, and so I'd hope that they do another one, and they do another one, and so on and so forth. And it's really interesting when you start speaking to people who've have never done a VR piece versus people who've done a lot. And the responses to the same piece are so different, because for someone who's never experienced it, they might just be, oh my God, it was amazing. And then someone else is kind of, well, they didn't really think about this bit of presence, and then that resolution wasn't good, and it's, and so there's, novelty and awe always wear off. And I always encourage people to keep making the same things, to work with the same form again and again, because it's very unlikely that the first thing you make, it's possible, but it's very unlikely the first thing you make with a new technology or a new form you're working with is going to be the best thing you ever make. You know, you don't pick up a violin and play the best piece ever. If you do, great, it might happen. You know.
Yeah, I agree. I think what's really important in the early phase of some of these works is giving the audience something to anchor that experience around. And we talked a lot about sort of threshold spaces and the leading in and the out of as being really, really important. And some of the most impactful pieces of work that I've seen are ones where I've actually been given space at the end to then talk to someone about it maybe, and that might be what helps me kind of come to an understanding of what it is that I've just seen. And you're absolutely right, there's loads to be learnt from a very long history of traditional media production on how to do that and how to anchor those experiences as well.
Well, I also just think that it's nice, that fact, like I enjoy the fact that there isn't this particular form at this particular moment, because in reality it's something that you can't get around, which is like an intercontextual reference. Like when you watch a film, you can't not think about all the ones that came forward and like the genre. So obviously there's something nice about that, knowing, okay, I like horror, but obviously there's also, you know, people that call them the golden eras and stuff when things were just emerging. And so I personally enjoy the fact that it's like there isn't kind of set things within it, though, you know, if you do find something that works, you will ultimately end up using it. So it's an interesting space.
Hi, so you kind of rejected the conscious dot. So is agency necessary for immersion? Discuss.
You started the conscious dot discussion.
It's not 100% vital, but I think it helps a lot. So for instance, there have been pieces particularly to do with the technology and the way it is at the moment that a lot of the things I've seen this year are VR, so I'll talk about that for a minute, even though that's not always necessarily the focus. The headsets are heavy, they're kind of uncomfortable, and if I'm sitting in a 20-minute piece and only able to look and listen, it gets uncomfortable very, very quickly. But if I can get up and move around, or I'm told that I've got a task or a goal in that space, suddenly my attention kind of changes or shifts and I've got something else to focus on, and that means that I can last in that experience a lot longer. But I actually think it's a combination of factors. It doesn't have to be just agency. It might be something else. It might be the actual embodiment element that is more important, and the being able to kind of reach for something with my hands. You know, absolutely not. That we've all got films that we can point to that we were so immersed in for 90 minutes, and of course we had no agency or control over that. So it's not like there's a checklist of things that you absolutely have to have this, but I think it's a useful starting point to kind of having a toolkit of things to work your way through as to what is going to make someone more immersed in that space that you're creating for them.
Did you say essential or integral?
I said necessary, but
necessary.
It was a provocation.
Sorry.
So.
Well, I think it's a matter of degrees, isn't it? And even if you have agency, depending on what format you're delivering this notional immersive experience in, you could come up against the edges of your agency as well, very clearly in sort of playable stories or VR experiences. So I think for me, what I'm interested in is, as I touched on, is presence. So how we acknowledge the audience, the person that's experiencing it. And I think if we can do that, I think that's that's certainly sort of a first step. And maybe, I don't know this, I'm not 100% clear on this, but I suspect that that's more essential than agency.
I think it's maybe about being aware that there is agency as a maker, like being sort of, you might not use it, you might not utilise the audience or participants' agency, but being aware they have it. And I think it's kind of always really important. You know, the slightly sort of almost facetious answer would be, you know, a short story, someone writing an episodic TV series or a book, the audience has the agency to not read the second part. So they kind of they're aware of that agency, so they add cliffhangers. I think, you know, the audience always has some level of agency, and I think it's about thinking what you're aware of, because there's also an expectancy of agency, which I find really frustrating from audiences, where they're kind of like, well, I wanted to choose this, I wanted to do this, and I'm like, I'm an artist. I've got things to say. Sometimes I want control of authorship. I want to make something because essentially, look, this is a massive, interactive, engaging, immersive space where you've all got agency to do what you want. You're listening to us.
In the early days of sort of interactive documentary, when people were making browser-based work and going, oh, fantastic, we can give the audience the opportunity to kind of choose this way or that way, the choose your own adventure kind of stories. And everyone realised very quickly that audiences don't stick around for very long when you just kind of give them multiple options without some kind of guiding authorship involved as well. So there's a balance there for sure. All right, I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys.